Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webcast on residential heat pump water heater case studies. I'm Amin Delago with TRC, and I'll be your moderator for this session. Sorry we got started a little late. We were having some microphone issues and still trying to get it sorted, but we'll get started. So we have a few housekeeping announcements. First and foremost, I'd like to thank our sponsors and ACEEE ally members for their support of the Hot Water Forum and ACEEE. And please use the text on the right-hand side of your screen to ask any questions of the presenters. I'll gather all those questions and ask the presenters once all the presentations are complete. For questions that we don't get to and for an interactive discussion, please join us on Zoom platform immediately after this session. And the Zoom link is posted on the audience screen at the bottom of the page and also in the chat box to the right. And don't forget to make note of the passcode to get into the meeting room. And please refrain from using the chat for any dialogue other than asking questions. We'd really appreciate that. Also, be sure to use to check out the tabs on the left-hand side of the app. We ask everyone, please help us in our planning for our future hot water forums by filling out the survey. And if you do the testimonial, you'll receive a $25 discount off of next year's hot water forum registration. And all presentations will be available for on-demand viewing for registered attendees on the Socio platform within a few days, and they'll remain up till May. And presenter slides can be found on their page in the program participants section. So with that, I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers. They are Bruce Mann-Clark from Clear Results, Allison Bales from Energy Vanguard, Ben Knopp from Community Housing Partners, and Kevin Grease from Slipstream. So we'll get started with our first speaker. Bruce Mann-Clark is a nationally recognized leader in residential consulting on energy efficiency, technical training, implementation of conservation programs, and quality control testing. He's going to report on a 15-home demonstration pilot that installed heat pump water heaters in manufactured homes, including insights into venting and ducting techniques. And he's going to compare HUD versus site-built plumbing codes and several other things. It's going to be great. Take it away, Bruce.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank Energy Trust of Oregon for helping us conduct this research. A little bit about the Northwest. We have a lot of manufactured homes, and probably somewhere around 95% of them are all electric. So it's a big market for us. And even though this looks specifically at manufactured homes, a lot of the learnings can be, I think, transferred over to any time you sort of have tight space working conditions. These were the project goals. We wanted to really figure out how to put heat pump water heaters in manufactured homes. And we also wanted to determine a range of installed costs. A warning here, all installed costs that I'll show later on are not adjusted for the last year rapid increase in prices, especially with heat pump water heaters. Now, also, we interviewed the consumers at the end to see if we drove them crazy or not by putting a heat pump water heater in their house. Not to get all Dick Cheney on you, but sort of, the unknown unknowns, right? Stuff that, you should have known. Site selection, boy, we learned a bunch there. Breaker size on manufactured homes was a surprise to us. And whether it's rear discharge or side discharge was also a big surprise. Costs, we're giving you, basically, we're saying it's anywhere from $300 to $700, and that would be excluding any electrical upgrade, which would be probably around $500. And to give the answer away, we had high customer satisfaction off these. For those of you that have not worked in manufactured homes before, it's by definition tight spaces. I mean, there you have the crawl space underneath the house. And of course, you have the main line there and the sewer line and everything else running to get in your way. Just for those of you who don't know, manufactured HUD HUD code homes do not require an isolation valve for the water heaters, which complicates things like draining the tank, obviously. And the closets they're put in are always tight. Yeah, guess what? Rather than having a 35 amp break, excuse me, a 30 amp breaker like most site builds in the Northwest, these had a 25 amp breaker. And the implication of that was we either called an electrician, again, maybe at a $500 cost, or choose a tank that will accept the 25 amp breaker. And there's one of them out there. Utility room example, just to kind of give you a feel here, more tight spaces, and the gentleman, the technician on the right-hand side has a jigsaw out, and we had to enlarge the closet or the opening of the closet in a lot of these homes just to get the tanks in place. This was sort of a really nice example, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on here. The real use of the insulation pad here was to get around the fact that the plumbing comes in from the bottom, and the heat pump water heater with a pan underneath it had a wider base, so they weren't exactly aligned to go up. So basically what that pad with that notch allowed us to do was come out and over. Another thing we found out about HUD code is, despite the fact that they go on pressboard floors all the time, they do not require something as simple as a drain pan. If you are going to duct it, especially on a side or rear discharge, you have to allow for at least 5 inches for the duct adapter itself. I think one of the major manufacturers is going to come out with a unit that's going to be both intake and exhaust ducted off the top. That would help us in several locations in regards to space. Okay, I wish you could see just how rotten this floor really was. They had a small leak, and basically, if we had to repair the floor, we stayed away from that site. And unfortunately, there was quite a few that we did not accept in the study, just because of that rotting floor problem that something as simple as a drain pan would have probably addressed. The installer on this project was brave. And this is just sort of, some of the obstacles you have to come over. I mean, just in this one thing, we have a stainless steel flex connection going to a PEX pipe, and then we have that existing polybutylene piping. Those of you that are familiar with polybutylene piping realize it's kind of got this history of cracking and whatnot, but we managed to overcome that, and we didn't have any leaks. But you got to go there prepared for just about anything. This is a picture of a drain pan that looks like it's beaten up. The reason it's looks like it's beaten up, well, because we had to take a hammer in it to get it fixed. And this is a good reason why not to use plastic drain pans, because they're not as malleable, and hitting them with a hammer doesn't have the same impact. So, this was at one of the few houses that had an isolation valve. It doesn't look like it came from the factory that way, though. If you are going to install heat pump water heaters with ducting, the plumber also has to be a reasonably good carpenter. And this individual was one of those. This was a double ducted job, and this was in a bedroom closet towards the end of the manufactured home. And we called it double ducting, where we took the air from outside and we deposited it back outside. These homes were in Western Washington, where we have fairly mild winters. If you did this in a colder climate, you would probably, hit the compressor shutoff temperature way too often, and you'd be operating as an electric resistance water heater quite a bit. Even some of the duct adapters, in order to fit, require just a little bit of modification. I think if I have one big takeaway from this, and if you're going to go to sort of non-standard installs, the installer sort of has to be creative and up for the challenge. The install sequence, we did a lot of screening. We did a lot of virtual screening, and the individual that worked for us got really good at it. We do have a screening, remote software that we use. And, basically, first right off the bat, after we learned, we looked at breaker size. We looked at, how big that closet was. We had them get the tape measure out so we could figure it out. We looked for floor damage. And of course, we got their consent saying, hey, do you mind if we're probably gonna have to make your closet a little bigger. So we got some consent there. And then when it came to tank selection, the important part was the breaker size. the size of the household, that kind of got us a surrogate for how much hot water they use, and whether it was rear discharge or side discharge. And again, a tank that discharged and took the intake off the top would have given us more flexibility than we had at the time. Once we got to the site, again, this was really up to the installer, but we figured out the piping runs. I helped with any louvering or ducting that we had to do. Then, of course, it's drain, remove tank, closet alteration. And again, if the house didn't have a control valve at the tank, that meant you had to shut off the water supply to the whole house. And we modified the closet as needed. Install sequence, it was, install the ducting, or any louvering. We did that drain pan installation at that point. Sometimes that hammer was required. Placement of the heat pump water heater, lift tank into place. When you've got a drain pan sitting on a piece of styrofoam and a narrow space, it's kind of hard to get a hold of that. We never did investigate the water tank lifting devices, but I think if we did it again, they would have come in really handy. And of course, you have to orientate the tank in the right position, connect the ducting, do the plumbing, fill the tank, connect the PT, drain, and condensate lines, which sounds easier than it actually was. And then commissioning, where you wire, energize, check for leaks, and observe the startup sequence. The one thing missing here is the step of customer education. Methods to overcome that restricted space. Basically all the manufacturers right now are around 700 cubic feet. So by definition, we had to overcome restricted space or volumetric constraint on every house that we went at to. 3 of the homes we did double ducting, intake and exhaust. The most common one was inside to inside. One of our favorite techniques was to take the air out of the utility room, which usually sometimes had the electric furnace with the water heater, and we dumped that air, if it was connected to the kitchen, right behind the refrigerator, so we wouldn't get any "gee, you're blowing cold air on me" complaints. Inside to outside, this is my least favorite form of ducting, especially in cool and cold climates. You're really adding to the infiltration load of the house when you do that. And then we did some creative louvering on 4 of the units also. Here's a nice example of us modifying a closet. Basically, we took one whole side out, and that allowed us to orientate the tank in a way that made sense. And this is an example of where we took the air and discharged it directly behind the refrigerator, which was in the adjoining room in the kitchen. You can also see here in that lower right-hand corner and the door in the right-hand picture, that's a return for the furnace. So we did have a built-in louver, if you will. Here's an example of ducting, often not in a straight line. You got to take, what you're given sometimes. The different manufacturers have different sort of fan strengths, and they can handle more restriction than others. This particular unit handled it just fine. Louvering, this was interesting. The pegboard was already in place on the lower half, and we added a nice big, essentially an HVAC return grill going in there. And we exhausted the duct back into the utility room. So that both these served as the intake, and we had an exhaust going out. A lot of information on here, and I know these slides will be given out. These were sort of the tank model attributes, and the one that we used was the Ream 30 amp. Shows all, whether, and this chart shows whether it's right or rear discharge, etc. Top and cold plumbing, whether, the plumbing's on the side or if it's on the top, what the compressor cutout temperature, and sort of, what it's best suited for. That one Ream 15 amp, it was for a single person household. And the big difference there is that, we only needed a 15 amp breaker, and the load of the house was really quite small. Tank selections, we used one A.O. Smith product, and that's where the homeowner installed their own 30 amp breaker. I'm correcting myself here. The one Ream 15 amp was a 2-person household, but still they didn't use much hot water. And the Ream 30 amp, where again the homeowner switched out the breaker, and then just because of the breaker amperage, we use 12 Bradford White products. Okay, participant responses. Overall satisfaction, and again, this is a 1 to 5 scale. Overall satisfaction of 4.7 out of 5. Satisfaction with water temp, 4.7 out of 5 again. 7 of the participants increased temperature. And one of the things I like about all these heat pump water heaters is they have a really good user interface that makes it easy for the homeowner to adjust temperature without getting a screwdriver out. Supply of hot water, again, high rating. Do you run out of hot water more? 1.3 out of 5. We did increase the tank size in 2 cases. They had 40s in there, and we put 50s in. And then, sort of a question I was really curious in was how much of an issue is the noise? And we did all we could to make sure that we weren't going to create too much noise. And then the last question was, hey, does the cold air coming out of it? We got a slightly higher score there. We got 2, but we did our best not to blow cold air on kitchen tables or where people watch TV. And again, behind that refrigerator seemed to be a successful tactic. This ended up being, the tank selection that we had. Conclusions. This is our conclusion. With the proper screening and a skilled and willing installer, and I can't emphasize that skilled and willing installer, it can get done. And I think, again, in any space that you have, limited volumetric spaces, they can be overcome. And, on average, it costs about $500. And, that's increased to now. And, again, if HUD code actually had, such intelligent thing as, 30 amp breakers and drain pans and an isolation valve on the water heater, the cost would probably be lowered and more homes would be eligible. The good news, the customer satisfaction was universally high. We did try to tell them, I know this water heater was free to you, but please give us your honest opinion. Having said that, it still may have impacted their opinion. And yeah, if you want my personal opinion, this is not a program that is for every installer. I think, I don't think it's going to be a market-based program. I think you want to create a fixed price offer and go out and recruit manufactured homes and give that homeowner a really good deal. It must fit the skill set and the business model of the installer. Or I could just say it's, if we picked the wrong installer, this project wouldn't have worked. And if you want to learn more, that's my contact information. And I will turn it over to the next presenter.
Thank you, Bruce. Looks like getting heat pumps into a small space is quite a challenge, and looks like it required a lot of creativity as well. Appreciate all the hard work and making these installs happen and sharing that with us. So I actually encourage the audience to post some questions. That'd be great. Now, turning to the next speaker, we have Allison Bales, who's the chief troublemaker at Energy Vanguard, a business science firm in Decatur, Georgia, that focuses on residential HVAC design, consulting, and training. Co-presenting is Ben Knopp, who is a project manager at Community Housing Partners, a Virginia-based nonprofit. He has a background in building science, mechanical system design, and energy efficiency. Allison and Ben will share field monitoring results on the performance of heat pump water heaters in several homes, with details on MERV filtration versus OEM and other insights. Allison is having microphone issues. If they are still present, Ben may be pinch hitting and speaking on his portion of the presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Allison and Ben.
Sounds like we can't hear you, Allison. Too bad. Nothing. Well, sorry everyone. Sorry from Allison. Be great to have him on here, but we'll have to be stuck with me for this. So what we've done is just analyze data from installed heat pump water heaters, and we'll get right to it. So in this study, we're looking at just packaged heat pumps, so we're not looking at any split heat pumps. But the two basic types of these packaged heat pumps are ones that are not so easily ducted and ones that are easily ductable. Just for those of you who aren't very familiar with heat pump water heaters, they draw in room air and have a compressor inside that concentrates that heat down into the water, and then they blow out cold air, and when it's humid, that air becomes dehumidified somewhat. So this is from Allison's home. He has an 80-gallon heat pump water heater. You see this pattern a lot in most climates that have a significant outdoor temperature swing. You'll see much higher usage in the winter that drops significantly into the summer. And that's twofold. Studies have shown generally that in the winter, homes use about twice as much water as they do in the summer. And also the incoming water temperature is lower. So it just takes a lot more water heating energy in the winter. What Allison wanted to point out here is that there's a spike here in the middle of the summer in September where you can tell it's over twice as high as what you would expect. And that's the month that he drained, flushed, and refilled his water heater to clear sediment. And it had a pretty substantial impact. And so I'm sure going forward, he'll try other ways of flushing that maybe don't involve emptying the entire tank. So there are multiple methods for doing that, but it was a surprise to him and to me to see that much of an impact from flushing his tank. So he has, his is rated at with a UEF of 3.7. It used 486 kilowatt hours in 2020 and then 527 in 2021. This is a couple years of data, I guess. And we talked about that jump in September. He had a 3.5-year simple payback for his water heater. So this is a graph that shows really the brunt of the data that we've collected from 20 households, 2 of which were electric resistance water heaters in the Mid-Atlantic area, and then 18 homes with various heat pump water heaters. 11 of those were more like mixed warm climates, and 7 of them were cold climates. And what you'll see here is the average of all of these 18 heat pump water heaters, even the cold climate ones, is that this metric is kilowatt hours consumed per person per day. So we've normalized it for the amount of occupants in the home, because that's really what drives water heating usage quite a bit. So we wanted to be able to compare homes that maybe had just one person, a couple people, 4 or 5 people on a per occupant per day basis. And what we see is that across the board, we're getting averages well under 1 kilowatt hour per person per day with heat pump water heaters. And with those 2 electric resistance water heaters, we're seeing 2.5 to 3 times as much energy use, and really a much more dramatic increase in energy use during the winter. So let's look at some other detailed information about some specific water heaters. So this is an analysis just to see, okay, how much of the energy is due to standby heat loss. So some experiments I did were when I left for a week-long vacation, I used the vacation mode naturally on my water heater. And what I found out is that on my particular Rheem heat pump water heater, vacation mode drops the set point to 65 degrees and maintains that using electric resistance heat. And then when you set it back into another mode, it uses electric resistance to bring it back up to temperature. So that is that value of 0.68 kilowatt hours is per day. It's all the energy, all the electric resistance heating used for the whole week divided by the number of days that I was gone. And then the next time I went on vacation, I left it in heat pump only mode because I knew it would actually use less energy. And I set it to 110 degrees. That's the minimum set point. And it used less than half the energy, but it still used 0.31 kilowatt hours per day to maintain that. So what that tells me is that if I look at a sample of my total water heater use is in these green bars, and you'll see that during the summer months, about half of my energy use for the water heater was just maintaining tank temperature, and the other half was the actual water that I used. Now that changes when you get into the colder months here in Virginia. Incoming water temperature dropped down to about 43 degrees in the winter at the lowest point. Using more water in the winter, that just means that a lot more of the energy goes into heating the water. And I will say that my household has a lower than average water use. So for most people, definitely well over half of the energy use is actually delivered hot water and not necessarily standby heat loss. But it's interesting to point that out nonetheless. Another interesting thing is that a lot of people, when they think about heat pump water heaters, they're like, oh, it's robbing heat from my space. Oh, my heating system has to make up that heat. What's interesting is you don't hear that a lot about refrigerators, which are very similar, but just the opposite. They're adding heat to your space. But you don't generally hear people saying, oh no, is it going to overwhelm my air conditioner? And is it going to make me super uncomfortable to have a refrigerator right in the middle of my kitchen producing heat? And so what I did was just compare how much heat are these. So there are two heat pumps. One is pumping heat out of the fridge into the room, and the other is pumping heat from the room into the water. So this is over 3 years of total energy consumption by each appliance. And you'll see that the fridges in my house, it's an 18 cubic foot fridge with 3 occupants. It's actually fairly close to the amount of energy that the heat pump water heater is taking out of the air. So just keeping that in mind, that at least in my household, it's very similar in terms of the impact on the temperature of the space. So one myth that we like to address is that heat pump water heaters are just for warm climates. So what we did was just analyze a cold climate. So we took Anchorage, Alaska, and modeled, used some incoming water temperature models from the Florida Solar Energy Commission there that allowed us to kind of map what would be the incoming water temperature. We looked at, we took into account the extra heat that would need to be added to the home in Alaska throughout the year. And we assumed a cold climate heat pump with electric resistance backup heating to make up the heat that the water heater stole from the air. Assumed 300 days of heating up there in Alaska and an average water temperature of 43.3 degrees, and still had a COP of 1.72. So still, on an energy standpoint, still beneficial in a climate as cold as Anchorage. So we wanted to point that out. Also wanted to have a look at how filtration impacts the airflow of a heat pump water heater, and look at its impacts on keeping the coil clean. So we measured a couple Rheem 4th generation heat pump water heaters with a clean stock filter and got 125 CFM and 130 CFM. And this is with the settings indicate that the fans have 2 speeds, but we've only ever observed low speed. So an experiment that we did was duct it to a MERV 13 filter, which might sound crazy, but it was oversized, so 12 by 24 by 2 inch MERV 13 filter, and it had a very minimal impact on the overall airflow. Knocked it down to 121 CFM, so like a 3 to 5% drop in total airflow through the heat pump water heater. Then I left the filter for almost 3.5 years without changing it. And this is what it looked like at the end of its life when I decided to replace it. And I measured the airflow, and it was still 119 CFM. And all these airflow measurements were with a highly precise powered flow hood. So they're extremely accurate airflow measurements. So yeah, that's a pretty nasty filter, but still moving a perfectly fine amount of air. So here's a look at a couple coils. The coil on the left is after 2.5 years with the stock filter. It doesn't look bad, but you can see, especially over on the left side, it's a little blurry, but there is some dust accumulation there. And then you'll notice a few fibers that have made it through that rather coarse plastic filter that comes stock. And then on the right hand, this is after 3.5 years with the MERV 13 filter. It's hard to find anything on that coil. So, conclusion on that is the stock filter does a decent job. If you want to keep your coil pristine and not have to clean that stock filter every few months, you can put in an oversized MERV 13 and really forget about it for years and have a pristine coil, which also, the dust itself as an insulator reduces performance of a coil. But what is harder to see is the biofilm that starts to build up on a coil that gets wet, like a heat pump water heater coil. So if you want to keep your coil pristine, these water heaters can handle an oversized MERV 13 and do great. So thanks for your time. Here's contact info for Allison and I. We've got a couple more slides with some ducting photos if you're interested, if we have time later, but I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you both. Ben, that was really interesting. Thanks for pinch hitting for Allison. And yeah, I like less maintenance. That's always a winning combination. So we'll go ahead and switch over to Kevin Grease. He's an analyst at Slipstream with a background in applied economics. he has a particular interest in analyzing electrification technologies in cold climates. Kevin will be speaking on field monitoring results on the performance of heat pump water heaters in 9 homes in the Midwest and share results from a survey of 80 rebate participants. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you. And great job, Ben and Allison. I haven't seen your presentation, but I'm happy to hear a lot of the results are consistent. Anyways, so I'm with Slipstream, and we did a field study and survey on heat pump water heaters in cold climates. I'm sorry. There we go. Okay, so a basic overview of the project. Well, we did a field study with 9 sites, and you could see one of the water heaters in our study is right here that we monitored. So I'll start by going through performance of the systems, the cost and carbon savings, and then we also took a particular interest in trying to quantify if the stolen heat from the heat pump water heater was causing the furnace to run more. And then we'll go through the survey results. So our partner in this project is called MECA. It's the Michigan Electricity Cooperative Association. So they oversee 13 municipal utilities and electric cooperatives in Michigan. So they tended to be in rural areas, so a lot of single family homes, a lot of electric heat, and a lot of delivered fuels. For the program, at least the field study, we identified 9 sites from people who got rebates on heat pump water heaters through an energy efficiency program. And all of the heat pump water heaters in our study were 50-gallon tanks. They had UEFs around 3.5, and they were all installed in basements. We did a year-long monitoring from 2020 to 2021, and then we also conducted a survey of 81 households. So you could see MECA utilities are all the colored polygons here, and the stars are where we did field studies. And the survey could come from any of those colored areas. So the measurements in the study were pretty robust. We measured water temperatures, water flow, air temperatures, and current each second, and the power data and whether the furnace was running, we recorded that each minute. And then we also put a monitor next to some auxiliary heat to make sure people weren't running auxiliary heat, or at least controlling for that when we were estimating the heating load, space heating load of the house. So we were particularly interested in testing heat pump water heaters in cold climates. And as Ben mentioned actually previously, this can be more challenging in cold climates because first, the groundwater temperature is lower. And then second, we're installing them in basements, and they weren't conditioned basements. So they tended to be colder than maybe like a California garage would be warmer than 63 degrees Fahrenheit on average. And that can impact the compressor performance. The figure on the right basically is just all these gray lines are just each site in the study, and the darker pinkish line is the median groundwater temperature over the study period. So we can see that the impacts are definitely seasonal. Groundwater temperature goes down when it's cold outside. So in general, and this is a big factor in the study, we had lower water usage than at least the DOE test conditions where they rate heat pump water heaters. So from the figure on the right, you can see that, so each one of those box plots is each site. And and that's the y-axis is the daily hot water usage. So they varied quite a bit across sites, and most of them are below the DOE test conditions. On to the energy efficiency. So to clarify terms here, I think that Ben and Allison's presentation might have referred to COP as we're referring to energy factor. So what we call energy factor is basically a metric that in the numerator, we have the useful energy delivered to the house in the form of hot water. And in the denominator is the total input energy. It's electric energy in a heat pump water heater's case. And this is analogous to uniform energy factor. So, and then the COP, for our purposes, we were just referring to the efficiency of the compressor. So not the whole system. So it doesn't include standby loss, basically. Rated efficiencies were around 3.5, as I stated. Now, when you look at the field conditions, there are measured field conditions. We had a significant drop-off in energy factor. And the big reasons why this is happening, the first one is the water usage concept that I brought up earlier. Basically, when there's, so basically standby loss makes up a bigger portion of the total input energy used when there's low water usage. So then it's like a bigger piece of that total pie of delivered energy. I don't know if I said that in the clearest way, but basically the constant impact of standby loss is a bigger factor on low usage days, which drives down the energy factor. And then the second one, and this is another biggie, is in the field conditions, we suspect that the electric resistance backup coils are running quite a bit more. So to normalize this, we actually did make a model of heat pump water heater performance based on using all of our field data so we can make a more apples to apples comparison. And once we normalized all those inputs to the same conditions as DOE test scenarios, besides, we could not replicate the draw patterns. The energy factor was up closer to the rated efficiency, near 3. And just another interesting data point is the heat pump compressors in our study, the COP was just around 3.3. As I kind of touched on earlier, the biggest reasons for this discrepancy is, one, the lower water usage is really makes the energy factor take a hit. And then secondly, it's more electric resistance really drags down the energy factor as well. And that could be due to, people using water in the field differently, like taking a shower and running the washing machine all at the same time and the dishwasher, or it could do with the operating mode that the water heater's set in. So speaking of the operating modes, hybrid is a common operating mode that we saw in our study, and that basically allows for the compressor to operate, but then when it really needs it, it can get a boost from the electric resistance backup heating. So taking you through these two graphs, this is site 3, and we expect this one was in hybrid pretty much the whole time. And we see kind of a expected trend early where the energy factor is low on low usage days because that standby loss has a bigger impact. The sweet spot's around 50 gallons, 40 to 60, highest energy factors there. As you start to use more and more water, then the dots become more and more yellow, which the yellow indicates a larger percent of the input energy coming from the electric resistance coils. So then the energy factor goes back down again. In site 6, we saw kind of an unexpected pattern. We saw like 2 clouds here. And to be clear, these are 2 different models of heat pump water heater. So we suspect this first cloud is heat pump only mode. So that's just the compressor running. And we see that trend that we expected where energy factor goes up with usage. But then once we get to that sweet spot of 50, a lot of the days appear to be in hybrid mode. And we think, I mean, this is hybrid mode because both the compressor and the electric resistance coils are operating on these days. And the energy factor is just between like 1 and 1.5. But it just seems like in this site, the hybrid mode triggers a lot more electric resistance. And that could be due to draw patterns, could also be due to how the algorithm in the heat pump water heater is determining when electric resistance is needed. Carbon and cost savings. So this is based on our model in cold climate scenarios using 50 gallons of water a day. We saw about $300 of savings for electric resistance water heaters, which is great, or with the electric resistance water heater as the baseline. And that will likely cover incremental costs. Propane was pretty good savings too. Natural gas, less savings, barely any savings at all. So still need work there. Another objective of the project was quantifying the space heating impacts. So basically we have your heat pump water heater here, and it's taking in heat, stealing heat from the environment. And we wanted to determine if the heat pump water heater stealing heat in the environment is causing the furnace or the thermostat to call for more heating in the furnace. So what we found here is first this figure on the left. Each one of those lines is just a temperature sensor. We had an array of sensors, temperature sensors next to the water heater to account for stratification in the basement. And you could see that there's definitely a dip in temperature, about 2 degrees or so, during compressor cycles. So we do have a local impact on space heating. But then we did an analysis did some regression analysis to try to determine if that impact is actually causing the heating load or the furnace to run more. And basically we couldn't find statistically significant impacts. And one of the reasons why is really the heat pump water heater was only taking about, the heat that was extracting was about 2% of the heating load. So that kind of just falls into the noise. Plus, the thing is pretty far away from the thermostat, so we couldn't detect an impact there. Satisfaction. So we were happy to see this. This is from the 81-person survey, and everyone seemed very satisfied, touting the dehumidification benefits. Interestingly, Ben mentioned that vacation mode may not save as much energy as consumers think. I'd say from our data, we did notice big spikes in electric resistance when they got back. So that kind of corroborates that finding. We also noticed a couple people commented on anode rods, the wrong anode rod being installed in their water heater. And then they had this terrible sulfur taste and smell. They were able to fix it, but it's just something to consider for the future. We also asked about the comfort impacts. So basically, were people uncomfortable by the cooling and dehumidification effect of the heat pump water heaters? For context, these are mostly single family home basement installations. So people aren't generally occupying the space next to their water heater in these cases. But most of them didn't even notice the change. A lot of them enjoyed the dehumidification and cooling benefits. So that generally didn't appear to be a big problem in our use case. Smaller houses, maybe different results. Some concluding thoughts. Number one, people like the heat pump water heaters. That was great to see. Number two, there was significant cost and carbon savings compared to electric resistance water heaters. 3, higher water usage is going to have higher savings and higher efficiency for that matter, at least to some extent. So that's important for targeting candidates. Maybe something to think about when targeting smaller users. The control settings or the operating modes are important for optimizing performance, and we didn't notice any impact on space heating, and people didn't seem to be bothered by the comfort impacts. Our next steps here is first to communicate the findings as we're doing now, and then we're interested at Slipstream in researching more emerging water heating technologies, 120 volt heat pump water heaters, central heat pump water heaters, and then continue figuring out the best ways to deploy these 240 volts. Please do reach out to me if you have any questions or comments, and I'll leave a copy of or a link to the full report in one of the chats, the Zoom chat, or here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. That was fantastic. It was really comprehensive and covered a lot of topics. And it's great that you got a report out to kind of go even deeper. So it looks like we have a couple minutes before closing the session. Maybe we can get a question or two in. I think maybe we'll start with George's question since it's on this last presentation. It was a clarification question. The question is, Kevin, when you say analogous to UEF, does that mean that EF or is equal to UEF, or is it EF, the previous metric, which itself is very similar to UEF, but not identical?
Thanks for the question, George. It's not identical. I think UEF, and I don't know the exact specifications, but I think that's reserved for the lab testing protocols. And our energy factor is it's a field version of that. So we're definitely not directly imitating that, but conceptually, it's only including useful energy in the numerator, which is the same as UEF. So basically accounting for standby losses coming out of the tank. So that's why I say it's similar. It's like a field version of UEF.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. So I think we'll transition to Zoom for the remainder of the questions. I'd like to thank all our speakers for their presentations and our attendees for participating in today's webcast to close out the 2022 forum. Again, if you'd like to continue exploring the presentations you've heard in this session today, please follow us to the Zoom chat room. The link can be found at the very bottom of the page or to your right on the chat. And please copy the passcode. Thank you so much. And we'll close this out. Take care. Thank you.